Hello, and welcome to my Borderpolar podcast. Today, I want to talk about a couple different coping mechanisms opposite to emotion and something I call actions before feelings. So, before we actually talk about opposite to emotion, I want to talk a little bit about the differences between what is an emotion, what is a feeling, what are thoughts, and what are behaviors. So, your basic emotions are actually unconscious emotions. They originate in the limbic system of the brain. And they include things like happiness, fear and surprise, anger and disgust, and sadness. You can also use the word joy instead of happiness. And these are responses in the physical body. They're going to be your body's going to be releasing neurotransmitters. There's going to be quickening of your heart rate or slowing of your heart rate. Different types of things are going to be going, physiologically speaking, are going to be going on in your body as a response to these basic unconscious emotions. And most of these and these are out of our control. They just happen. And I'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute here. Then we have feelings. Feelings are going to be a lot more varied. They are conscious responses to emotions. They're subjective, so they're going to be relative experiences that are based on an individual's perception. And like thoughts and behaviors, the neocortex of the brain is responsible for the responses that our body has to what's going on in the limbic system of the brain. And the neocortex of the brain is the higher functioning portion of the brain in higher order mammals. And so it's going to have a lot to do with that conscious thought and relaying the messages from the brain to the body in terms of motor functioning. So our behaviors and how our emotions translate into feelings, thoughts, and behaviors is going to happen there in the neocortex of the brain. Our thoughts are going to be conscious as well, and they're going to be based on emotions and feelings and also past experiences. They're again subjective, so they're relative experiences based on our perception. Thoughts and feelings are things that we might not feel like we have control over, but we can learn to control these things, not like emotions where we can manage our emotions, but we can't have control over them. They're automatic responses. Behaviors, we ultimately have the most control over. And these are actions that occur in response to our emotions, feelings, and thoughts. And again, that's part of in the neocortex of the brain as well. We want to talk about those six basic feelings or those six basic emotions. Let me say that again. Now, as far as facial expression is concerned, um, anger and disgust have the same basic look, and fear and surprise have the same basic look. So some people might lump those together, but let's talk about the function that each of these emotions um, serves, adaptively speaking. And what I mean is, how have we adapted, and what function does each of these emotions serve for helping us to adapt to our environment? So the adaptive function of surprise is exploration. So when we experience surprise, it's going to facilitate our attention to be drawn to something, our focus to be put on something, and it's going to promote exploratory behavior. So if you think about in terms of lesser mammals or mammals of lower order functioning, or even reptiles and birds, that element of surprise, that emotion of surprise, is going to prompt them to explore in a way to help them to adapt to their surroundings. Now, the emotion of disgust is going to give us an adaptive function of rejection. So maybe if you bite something and it's not palatable, it would tell you that it's not something you should eat, so you would spit it out, that sort of thing. So it'll help to give us responses for escape or avoidance. And on the opposite spectrum, it helps us to enhance those habits that are healthy and hygienic. And that's what disgust serves, adaptively speaking. Joy, as an adaptive function, is affiliation. So when we experience things that are joyful or enjoyment, we want to be affiliated with that more because it generates more positive attitudes. So we'd want to affiliate ourselves with things that bring joy, whether that would be other human beings, other animals, experiences. But when we feel that joy, we want to be affiliated with it. So it increases our capacity for enjoyment when we feel that. And fear has an adaptive function of protection. So we have those responses for escape and avoidance. That one's pretty self-explanatory. Anger's adaptive function is self-defense. It's going to give us some an increase of the energy that we need in the moments of self-defense responses when those are necessary. And then sadness, which is hard sometimes to pinpoint why we would want sadness. How is that an adaptive function? But the adaptive function of sadness is reintegration, meaning it helps us to increase our cohesion with other people. So it's sort of like empathy or sympathy. It helps us to increase our cohesion with other people, especially those who are in the same emotional state as ourselves. So even though it might not seem like sadness has an adaptive function, it does, in terms of being able to relate to others and things like that. So after we've identified these six basic emotions, we can take a look at what is called a feelings wheel or an emotion wheel. And you can see those six basic emotions there on this side. I can't tell. On this side, in the middle, you can see anger, disgust, sadness, or happiness, which you could say joy, surprise, and fear. And as they extend out, as those emotions extend out into other feelings, you can see how much more diverse you can get and how you can describe the way your body feels in response to these emotions that you have. You might feel mad, you might feel enraged, you might feel violated, and these all stem from that basic emotion of anger, which again is a physiological response inside your body. And so you can see the difference between how complex feelings can be, how subjective they can be based on the experiences you have and how you perceive the situation, whereas those basic six emotions that you feel are all arising in a different area of your brain and for a different reason. And so there is a difference between emotions and feelings, and it's important to note these types of things and be aware of it so that you can be aware of what is and isn't out of your control. Opposite to emotion action is actually a skill used in dialectical behavior therapy or DBT. It's called to emotion action, and it's used for reducing problem behaviors. So if you take a look above me here at these opposite emotions, so you have a list of what are considered negative emotions and what are considered positive emotions. And that's relative because they're negative because we think they're negative, but all emotions, um, all of the emotions that come into our bodies, fear, anger, sadness, happiness, surprise, all of them aren't good or bad. They just are. And we have to just accept them and let them be. But if we don't want to have feelings that we don't enjoy, then we want to try to change how we feel. And in order to try to do that, we have to manage these emotions that we might deem negative. And that's where DBT comes in. And so we're trying to reduce problem behaviors in that we want to try to change or reduce behaviors that fuel what we consider negative emotions. So if you are feeling negative emotions and you continue to have behaviors that are making these negative emotions feel more intense or increase in duration, then you want to change your action so that the negative feelings and negative emotions can start to subside. So you want to identify your emotion action, that natural urge to react. You know, if you're angry and you feel like you want to yell, if you're frustrated and you feel like you want to throw something, if you're happy and you feel like you want to jump up in the air, whatever it is, if you have a emotional reaction, a natural urge to react, and we have negative behaviors that we want to change, we can use opposite to emotion action to try to do this. So we identify our emotions and then identify that mood dependent behavior. So if your mood dependent behavior is yelling, if you're mad and you yell and you don't want to yell anymore, then you want to use opposite to emotion action. So when you're angry, display an action that's opposite of an angry emotion. So you're going to conduct that opposite to emotion action. Let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. In practice, you would use mindfulness, being aware of a situation without judging it. Use mindfulness to notice the emotion. I'm angry. Not to say it's bad, but to say I'm angry. Notice what your urge is. I feel like yelling. And if possible, notice what event prompted you to feel that way. You know, did you get cut off in traffic? Is the line at the grocery store taking too long? Was it nothing? Because sometimes that happens too, unfortunately, with these disorders. But if you can recognize what prompted the event, your interpretation of that event, because maybe you were already feeling impatient, or maybe you're late for something, or maybe you just tend to have anxiety under certain circumstances. But you're going to have an interpretation of that event There is going to be an event that prompted your emotion. And if you can recognize these things and notice your emotion, then you can now move on to the next step and say, are you justified or unjustified in how you're feeling? Don't suppress your emotion. Don't try to knock it out of the way, because when we suppress emotions, they just tend to get bigger. Remember, our emotions themselves are not the problem. It's the urges to act on our emotions and or the intensity of the emotion that is the problem. So we want to know, is the emotion justified? Is the intensity of the emotion justified or helpful? If the emotion isn't justified or the intensity of the emotion isn't helpful, then you want to try to do the opposite of that emotional urge, or do all the way opposite action. Now, for me, I try to use opposite to emotion action. I use it every day. I walk around most of the time fueled with negative thoughts and negative energy, but I detest negativity. And so I don't try to give off that negative energy. So if I'm walking through the house and I feel something negative and terrible wanting to come out, I stop and I tell my children how beautiful they are or how much I love them, or I comment on how beautiful it is outside or something interesting that I see. I try to use opposite to emotion action all the time, because if I didn't, then I would be spewing negativity all the time, and that's not the kind of person that I want to be. So let's look at some examples of how you can use opposite to emotion action. For anger, instead of engaging in conflict, act opposite to that emotion by gently withdrawing. Or even better, doing something nice for someone else. Helping someone else when you're angry or sad is often a great way to change how you're feeling. It'll make you feel grateful. It'll make you feel helpful instead of feeling angry or sad. If you're feeling fear or anxiety, instead of hiding or avoiding, try to approach what you're afraid of with full commitment. You're going to feel better if you can conquer what you're fearing. If you're feeling unjustified guilt or shame, which happens quite a bit with these disorders, if you're feeling unjustified guilt or shame, instead of trying to keep that thing that's not supposed to be shameworthy, or something that isn't shameworthy, or something that isn't morally wrong, instead of keeping it a secret, expose it with the spirit of acceptance. I did this, and that's okay, because we shouldn't be feeling guilty for things that we don't need to be feeling guilty for. But if you have justified guilt or shame, if you did something that was out of line with your values, apologize, rectify the situation, and do something that's in line with your values that's going to overshadow that thing. Go out of your way to help someone fix the problem. Don't just sit and seethe. Here's some ways you can use opposite to emotion action in these instances. And here's some examples of what you can do to practice opposite to emotion in real life, um, on a more basic level. So if you're feeling sad, you can watch a funny movie or some funny clips on YouTube, or listen to some music that cheers you up. If you're fatigued or tired, listen to some fast or some loud music. If you're feeling isolated, or if you feel like isolating, call a friend or a family member. If you feel fear, do a little bit of what you fear. If you're feeling anger, don't lash out. Move away from the person or the situation that you're in. If you feel like quitting therapy, that's the time to go to your appointments. I know it seems difficult to do the opposite of what you're feeling, but it's lucrative. It's so lucrative. And and then we move on to actions before feelings, which is how I always remembered this coping mechanism. But it might be termed feelings follow behaviors. You might hear it feelings follow actions. You might hear it actions before behaviors. But basically, it has to do with the way that we want to think about processing the way that things flow in our bodies. Generally, generally we think of things like we see here on the side. We have a feeling, it generates certain thoughts, and then actions follow. And so if we have negative feelings, we have negative thoughts, and a lot of times those negative thoughts seem to prevent ourselves from pursuing positive actions. So when you try to think about feelings before, or when you try to think about feelings following actions or actions before feelings, kind of get rid of that whole idea that your feelings have to generate thoughts, which have to have actions that follow, and try to think about, in response to those negative thoughts that you're having, do a positive action. And by doing that positive action, you will generate positive feelings. So you can change that cycle by taking a positive action in response to those negative thoughts. So actions before feelings or feelings follow actions. Remember that action creates emotion. Action creates emotion. So I have a prison guard experiment here listed here. So there was this experiment done by these college students where they took them and they gave them an assignment. One, some students were meant to be prisoners and the other students were meant to be prison guards. And they put them into these roles. And the experiment didn't last very long because of how into the roles they got. The prison guards ended up punishing the prisoners, and the prisoners ended up feeling isolated and depressed and sad. And they got so into these roles that weren't even real because they were going through the actions that they would be going through if they were the prisoners and if they were the guards. Similar to that would be an actors falling in love while playing the parts of love interests in a movie. So they're not only going through these actions of love on set, but they're also close to each other. They're mimicking love movements. They're touching one another. So they go through these actions, and then these emotions end up coming up through the actions. And so a lot of times, these love interests in movies will end up falling in love in real life. So those are just a couple of examples of how action creates emotion. And then I want you to think about your future self and the decisions that you make today and how they impact your future self, and have empathy for your future self. What would my future self want me to choose now? What would my future self decide? And think of your in the moment self who's not really thinking about the long term as your smaller self, and your future self as your higher self, the self that's thinking about the long term consequences. So if you think in terms of I'm going to think, and then I'm going to feel, and then I'm going to do, you're thinking of these short-term considerations and your mind is being led by your smaller self. But if you think I'm gonna have thoughts, I'm gonna do something, and then I'm going to feel how I'm gonna feel after I do the thing. So if I do the positive thing, I'm gonna feel positive. You're thinking in terms of long-term considerations, and you're being led more by your higher self. So have empathy for your future self, for your higher self, and try to think in those terms. So these actions that you take can lead to the positive feelings that you're wanting. Living by your values is very important when you think about actions before feelings. So on one of the websites that I looked up, they identified these 4 steps to try to live by your values, so to speak. The first step would be to identify golden behaviors. So behaviors that always make you feel good, things that you're always going to walk away feeling good from. If you can identify a number of these golden behaviors and clarify why they make you feel good. I always feel good when I listen to music and dance. I always feel good if I take a bath. I always feel good when I'm spending time with people I enjoy. I always feel good at doing a lot of different things. And if I list those golden behaviors out and clarify why they make me feel good, then prioritize your focus areas. Choose maybe three golden behaviors that you can go to when you're trying to change the way that you're feeling by doing an action to create a feeling. And then you want to focus on cultivating that in the moment awareness and take action. And here's how you do that. You have to learn to see those opportunities as they arise. So you have to start by recognizing your emotions and your feelings. So you have to look for an opportunity to try to change the way you're feeling by doing an opposite to emotion action and putting your action first to have a feeling follow. Note any resistance that's trying to hold you back from taking action. If you're feeling anxiety about doing something, if you're feeling fear, if you're feeling stressed out, observe the sensations in your body that accompany those resistant feelings. If your heart is racing, if you feel sweaty, if you're shaky, see how they ebb and flow and shift. One of the biggest components of learning to manage your emotions and your feelings is learning to pay attention to them. Then connect with your higher self, your long-term thinking self, and recall what your intention is in the moment. What did you want to do in this moment? Was it something as simple as get through it? Was it something more complex like get the dishes done? Was it something even more complex like get to work? And connect with your higher self and recall what your intention is. What do you want to do in this moment? And how are you going to act in a way that's going to be sympathetic and empathetic to your future self? And then consider that question: how would future me feel after doing this? if you come up with an answer that's going to feel expansive, I feel good after, my future me will feel good after having done this. But if you feel, then do it. But if future me feels contracting, if it doesn't feel like you'll feel good, then don't do it. But consider future self and then take action based on your answer. And that's going to, this whole process is going to open your mind up to thinking for the long term. And it's going to help you to get through those moments when action isn't so easy to take. And I'm not trying to say that knowing these coping mechanisms makes these coping mechanisms easy to do, but knowing them out. And like and subscribe if you want. And if you think this is helpful to anyone else, go ahead and share that with them if you want. And I have a podcast on Facebook, my Borderpolar podcast as well. And there's a private group for anyone with a borderpolar diagnosis who's interested in a support group as well. Have a nice day.